In one of your tweets, you listed out some of the things you should study, like programming, sales, reading, writing, arithmetic. One of the items that ended up on the cutting room floor was that you should also study ethics.
I was originally going to put that out there as a concession to people who believe that making money is evil and that the only way to make it is evil. But then I realized ethics is not necessarily something you study. It's something you think about and it's something you do. Every one of us has a personal moral code. And where you got that moral code from is different for everybody. It's not like I can point you to a textbook. Sure, I could point you some Roman and Greek text, but that's not going to suddenly make you ethical. There's the golden rule, right? Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Or there's Nassim Taleb's silver rule, which is don't do unto others what you don't want them doing unto you. Once you've been in business long enough, you will realize how much of business is about trust. And it's about trust because you want to compound interest. You want to be able to work for long periods of time with trustworthy people without having to reevaluate every discussion, without having to rethink each time, and without having to constantly look over your shoulder. And so over time, you gravitate towards working with certain kinds of people. And similarly, those people will gravitate towards working with other ethical, quote unquote, people. So being ethical turns out to be a selfish imperative. You want to be ethical because it attracts the other long term players in the network. And then they want to do business with you. And if you build a good enough reputation for being ethical, eventually people will pay you just to do deals through you because you're the one who will validate and ensure the deals by your presence because you wouldn't be involved with low quality stuff. So being ethical actually pays off in the long run, but it's the very long run. In the short run, being unethical pays off, which is why so many people go for it. It's a greedy algorithm. But you can be ethical simply because you're long term greedy. And I can even outline a framework for different parts of so called ethics just based on the idea of long term selfishness. For example, you want to be honest because it leaves you with a clear mind. You don't have two threads running in your head. One is the lies that you told you to keep track of, and the other one is what you're saying. You just have to think about one thing at a time. So you have more energy to think about that thing. So you're a clearer thinker. Also, by being honest, you're rejecting the people who only want to hear the pretty lies. So you force those people out of your network. And sometimes it's painful, like friends and family. But long term, you create room for the people who like you exactly the way that you are. So that is a selfish reason to be honest. For example, in negotiations, if you're the kind of person who always tries to get the best deal for yourself, you will win a lot of very early deals and it'll feel very good. But on the other hand, there are a few people who will recognize that you're always scrabbling and not acting fairly, and they will tend to avoid you. Over time, those people end up being the deal makers in the network because people go to them for a fair shake or to figure out what's fair. And so if you are cutting people fair deals, you don't get paid in the short term, but in the long term, everybody wants to deal with you and you end up being a market hub. You have more information, you have trust, you have reputation, and people end up doing deals through you. A lot of wisdom is just realizing the long term consequences of your actions. And so the longer term you're willing to look, the wiser that you're going to seem to everybody around you.
Uh, Probably a huge portion of why I'm so ethical is because of self-interest, enlightened self-interest. Uh, so I think what people don't realize is most things in life function on trust. They don't function based on contracts. They function based on trust. And so if you become very trustworthy, it gives you a massive competitive advantage, a huge leg up in life. And the thing is that this trustworthiness doesn't come overnight, but it's kind of like on a log scale. So once you it's like kind of like truthfulness, right? I mean, you sometimes use out small lies, but if you eliminate all lies, the power versus force we've talked about, what happens is that those attractor fields come into play, and humans feel they can trust you. And once humans feel they can trust you, the whole universe is at your disposal. So we see that in spades in Berkshire Hathaway. Berkshire Hathaway does all kinds of things where they just say something to someone and people will accept that. They don't need to have it in writing or anything like that. It just Warren's word is enough. And so how do you get there? Well, you get there by having a consistent life where have demonstrated repeatedly that you are, playing the game very ethically, playing the long game, and looking at things to make sure that your business partners and vendors and whoever you deal with is treated extremely well. Ray Kroc used to say that there were three stools on which McDonald's stands. He says, my franchisees, my vendors, and my employees, right? So the franchisees were all entrepreneurs, right? They owned and he felt he had to make sure that they did really well. The people supplying the French fries and the cups and the plates and all of that at McDonald's, Ray Kroc wanted to make sure they did really well. So he's not trying to squeeze them for the last penny. He wants them to do well, right? Because he says that it's part of my ecosystem. And I have taken those lessons to heart. So if I have a relationship with a printer for my business, I want those relationships to go on for decades. I want the printer to do well. I don't want to be squeezing him every time and get 3 quotes and take the lowest and all of that. I don't want to do it that way. I want to make sure that it's fair and we don't need to go to multiple quotes. We just run our business on trust. And so what happens is that when you show trust in a company or a human being, they react really positively. So my baseline when I'm dealing with anyone, my baseline is that the other person is a very high quality person or a very high quality company, and I can completely trust them. Then I wait to see if they do stuff which violates that trust. If it does violate the trust, we'll move on, we'll do something else. But I think when you upfront demonstrate the trust, a lot of good things happen. So I think this notion of being ethical, running things properly, gives you such a tailwind in life that it's, I think Peter Kaufman says, if crooks knew how much money you could make by not being crooked, they would stop being crooks, because basically you make a whole lot more money by being honest. You make a very little bit of money by being crooked, so it's a complete no-brainer to be ethical and honest.
If I'm in my last book, I wrote about the morality that emerges from games. There's a neuroscientist who you might be familiar with, Jaak Panksepp, who studied rat behavior in games. And he showed that if you pair 2 male juvenile rats together, the one with a 10% body weight advantage will pin the other almost 100% of the time. And you might say, well, what that demonstrates is that might makes right. The stronger animal wins. But if you pair them together repeatedly, after the first bout, the defeated rat, juvenile, has to be the inviter of play in the next match. So he'll invite the bigger rat to play. But over repeated pairings, unless the big rat lets the little rat win about 30% of the time, the little rat will stop inviting him to play.
Right.
So what happens is that you get an emergent morality, which is not the ability to win any given game, but the ability to repeatedly play a multitude of games. And there's something in that that's very much like what you wrote about in The Origin of Virtue, and something very much like a complex reciprocity. Right? So where you store your good behavior in your reputation, essentially. And that's of great advantage.
Yeah. And there is this, very, very simple thing that was happening in the 1990s when I wrote that book, which was the people were playing the Prisoner's Dilemma game on computers and finding out which strategy worked. And the Prisoner's Dilemma game is simply a game in which if both players agree to remain silent, then they benefit each other, but you can make a bigger gain by betraying the other one. But then if he betrays you as well, you both end up with nothing. So you've got to find a way of trusting each other enough to cooperate. You're being held in separate cells and interrogated separately is the sort of story that's being told. And it turned out that the best strategy in a repeated business dilemma game is tit for tat. That is to say, be nice first time round, cooperate on the first play, and then simply do whatever the other guy did on the previous play, so as to punish or reward the other guy for behaving badly or well. And
right, so you're not a sucker. With using that strategy, you're cooperative, but you're not
exactly.
a sucker.
Yeah. And in a sense, we are engaged in iterative, repeated prisoner's dilemma games all the time. You don't say, well, I'm not going to bother paying for this loaf of bread. I'm just going to grab it and run because then I'm better off, because then you can't go back to the shop the next day. You'll be recognized by the police. If
so it's morality as the shadow of the future in some sense.
Right. And again, this all comes back to Adam Smith, I think, because his previous book, his book in 1759, not The Wealth of Nations, but The Theory of Moral Sentiments, seems to me to have a very profound insight in me. And it's taken a long time for me to understand it. And that is that morality isn't, as it were, taught to us by priests and other people. It's essentially a calculation by us as to what works in the society we're in. And you kind of calibrate your behavior to find out what is moral, what is ethical, and so on. And, 500 years ago, the right ethical thing to do when somebody snubbed you was to, challenge them to a duel and run them through with a sword. Well, that doesn't get you very far today. So we've learnt that actually we've evolved a higher form of morality, sort of gradually by standing back and saying, in this society, what's going to get me the best rewards, given how other people are behaving? Because, of course, everything's a moving target.
It seems to me, too, that that's deep enough now. So imagine that the landscape that human beings occupy is a social landscape, but it's a social landscape that extends across time. And we've been conscious of that for a long time, at least 150,000 years. So that's about when we changed genetically into the subspecies that we are now.